Hello and welcome to Dressmaking Amore. Today I want to share with you how to sew this perfectly pretty balloon-sleeved lace-back button front dress. This silhouette of the V-neck fitted bodice that flares out into this beautifully gathered skirt is such a classic but super romantic and feminine. I really wanted to add a row of buttons down the front inspired by Zimmermann dress, and I think the sophisticated stand collar with the gorgeous voluminous sleeves completes it perfectly. The lace-back detail adds something special and it has pockets. Of course, we'll be using my Melody Dress PDF sewing pattern, so to follow along, get yours at the link below in the description. Here are the materials you'll need. Please refer to your instructional booklet that comes with your pattern to choose your right size and print and assemble the pattern perfectly, as well as follow all of the cutting instructions. And all the steps for the whole sewing process of the dress are in there. We need a woven fabric, so I'm using an Italian-made poly caddy fabric here. It's not stretchy, it doesn't wrinkle, and it has a beautiful drape, so it's perfect. After pre-washing your fabric, cut out your pattern pieces, and we have here the front, back, skirt back, back facing, the front facing, sleeve, sleeve bias binding, the pocket lining, as well as the ties and the loops. Okay, let's get to sewing. To prepare our pattern pieces, we will interface them for stabilization in specific areas. So our skirt pieces will be interfaced at the pocket opening section, and as for our front and back facing pieces, interface them fully. And then additionally for the front neckline facing, take a thin 1 cm wide strip of interfacing and stabilize the seam allowances like this. We'll begin by transferring the darts of the back bodice piece and pinning and sewing them. I like to sew a few millimeters right alongside the fold of the fabric and then smoothly flare out towards the mark. Overlock or serge the edges, the center back, and the shoulder edges. Then press all of the overlocked edges flat and press the darts towards the center back. Now place the back pieces of the bodice right sides together, pin, and sew your center back seam with seam allowances of 1.2 centimeters, and then press it open. We're going to do the same thing for the darts of the front bodice pieces. If needed, mark a guideline for yourself for sewing the darts so it's all accurate. At the front, we need to serge the dart seam allowances, as well as the shoulder and side edges. And we can hide the threads of the overlocker by splitting them and then tying knots at the base of the point and hide them between the seam with a tiny hook like this. Press the serged seams and then press the darts towards the center front. Remember that pressing is a very important part of the whole sewing process. All of your seams should be pressed and cooled with something like a wooden tailor's clapper in the process. Now the back lacing is optional, so if you prefer not to have this, no problem. But here we have our 10th pattern piece, the ties, which can be cut and sewn from multiple pieces. And we're going to fold it in half, right sides together, and pin. Sew 3 to 4 millimeters from the fold, or right in the middle, and at the start I like to sew at an angle to form a funnel shape. Then trim the seam allowances in half if needed. Now we're going to use a loop turner to flip this inside out. Insert the tool through the straight edge end, gathering the fabric on it until reaching the very end of the tie. Here we have the wider funnel opening, so catch the fabric, closing the clip at the end, and then pull the fabric slowly inside. Pull the rest of the fabric over and out and continue. The start is the hardest part, I promise it'll get easier. Pin the ties to your ironing board and press them while stretching or slightly pulling them with your other hand. They'll become even thinner this way. And in the same way, we'll work with our loop pattern piece. And out of this loop pattern piece, cut 4 loops, 6 to 7 centimeters long, just like this. And take your back bodice, and using the back pattern piece, trace the markings to the back side seams for the loop placement. It should look something like this. Then place our long ties at the top marks, and folding our short loops in half, pin them between the other marks with the wrong side, with the seam facing the serged seam. Our seam allowances are 1/2 inch here, so I'll have that much of the loop peeking out. Do this to all of your loops, making sure that they're identical in placement. And if you like, you can stay stitch them 1.2 centimeters from the edge so that they don't move around. Then place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams and side seams. And sew with 1.2 centimeter seam allowances. Here's the back and our loops. Now you can test your ties through the loops, checking that you like how everything is looking. Then press the seam allowances open with the loops turned towards the back. And for the last step here, we're going to sew the ends of the loops to the seam allowances of the front. And trim them so they'll be even with the seam allowances. Here are my pocket lining pieces and the skirt pieces. Pin the pocket lining right sides together to the seam allowances of the pocket opening of the front and back skirts, and then sew and serge. Serge from the skirt side. Press the seam allowances towards the pocket lining. Now we're going to turn out the pocket lining to the right side and understitch the seam allowances on all of our pocket openings. Of course, press, and then place the front and back skirt pieces right sides together and pin the side seams, including all along the pockets. Draw seam allowances as a guideline around the corners of the pocket opening to sew it straight. Then sew the side seam, carefully turning around the corners. And serge. Also, while we're here, serge the center back from the right side. It has 2 notches, while the center front doesn't. Now we need to press all the seams to even them out. Press the center back edge as well. And then we press the side seams towards the front. Making sure that everything lays smoothly, press from the right side as well, with the pockets laying towards the front. Now mark the pocket opening ends. I did it using some pins perpendicular to the seams. And then with the skirt pieces laying right sides together, matching the marks, pin the center back seam as well. To reinforce the pocket openings, make bar tacks or use a straight stitch forward and back a few times perpendicularly to the side seam. Secure both ends of the pocket like this, and then sew the center back seam. And press that seam open. At the top waistline edge of our skirt, place a gathering stitch or 2, with the length being about 5 millimeters. And with the skirt laying right side up, place the bodice on top, right sides together, and pin matching the center back and side seams. You want to gather the skirt in between the marks to match the skirt to the length of the bodice, and pin in between. And this is what it should look like. At both ends of the center front, there's going to be about 1 inch without gathering, and we need to leave this space for the seam allowances and for the closure. Now sew the waistline seam with 1.2 centimeter seam allowances. Take out the gathering stitch, serge, and press the waistline seam to flatten it. Press it from the right side as well, getting just the seam allowances. Place the front facing and back facing right sides together and pin and sew the shoulder seams. Here's what the corners look like, and this is because of the curved line seam allowances. After sewing, press the seams open, and then clip the corners of the seam allowances at an angle. Now we're going to serge only the outer edge of the facing. And if you want to leave a clean finish, you can fold the serge seam and place a straight stitch at the edge, and you'll have that clean edge with the hidden serger seam. Press to get rid of any waviness. Now here's our bodice front neckline. You'll see it's cut at an angle, it's not straight, and when fabric is cut at an angle or on a bias, fabric is stretched out a bit. So we need to stabilize this edge, and we'll do that with a stay stitch 6 millimeters from the edge, starting at the shoulder all the way down to this straight edge here at the front. The stay stitch is about 3 to 4 millimeters wide, and this is what it should look like. You can even gather the stay stitch a tiny bit, just 3 to 4 millimeters, making it so that you feel the tension of the thread. Check it with the length of the pattern piece, which it should be equal to. And we don't want any visible gathering. The fabric is just coming together so that the neckline will lay close to the body instead of staying away from it. Do the same to the other side. And then trim the seam allowances just to make them even and neat. After measuring and making sure they're even, take the facing and the dress right sides together and pin the neckline edge, matching the seams and notches. Sew all around from the facing side. And then turn the dress to the right side and the seam allowances towards the facing, and understitch the seam allowances all around the neckline, just 1 millimeter from the folded edge. Here you can trim all the seam allowances in half if you need a narrow seam, or you can trim gradually, so trimming only the seam allowances of the facing in half. That's what I'm going to do, as the seam allowances are going to be less visible with this method. Now press the neckline edge with the facing wrong sides together with the dress. And to secure the facing to the dress, pin it to the dress at the shoulder seams and the waistline like this. Now for securing the facing in its place, we have two options. We can either hand stitch or machine stitch into the ditch at the shoulder seams, or catch just the seam allowances here. Choose what you like more. I'm going to sew into the already made seam here so it won't be visible. See? Practically invisible. Now let me show you the other way as well. Here I just sewed the two seam allowances together like this. And repeat this for the waistline as well. Now for our beautiful balloon sleeves, fold the sleeve right sides together and sew and serge the side seams. press the seam to one side. Now place the sleeve seam at the middle of the sleeve like this, and place 2 pins at the top right where the fold starts. Place a 4 to 5 mm wide gathered stitch from pin to pin. Also at the bottom edge of the sleeve, place 1 or 2 rows of stitches for gathering, length of which should be 4 mm, and if doing 2, they're going to be 4 to 5 mm apart. I did 1 in gray thread for a better visibility. Now we need to mark the halves and the quarters. I clipped it here like this. Take piece number 9, the sleeve bias binding, and fold it in half right sides together and sew the short edge into a circle, like this, and press the seam open. Clip the seam allowance corners at an angle, and mark the quarters at the bottom on the bias binding as well. Now place the binding inside of the sleeve, right side of the binding towards the wrong side of the sleeve. Pin at the quarter marks and then gather the sleeve in between the marks. Pin in place. Now sewing from the sleeve side so that you have control over the gathering, seam allowances are 6 mm. Go slow and steady, using a pin to help guide the gathers as you like. Then press the seam to flatten the gathering. And trim, evening out the edge. And after this, take the binding and double fold it over the seam allowances to fully cover the seam we just sewed. Pin around so that the binding edge hides that seam completely. Here's what it should look like. Now we can hand base stitch the binding in place. Here's the close-up for you. I'll pick out the gray gathering thread later on. Sew 1 mm away from the edge. So take out the gathering stitches and take away the basting stitches here as well. And as you can see from the wrong side, I go along the bias a little bit, sometimes in between the bias and the fabric. That's why I like my method of sewing it here, as you can't see any mistakes on the right side. From here, it's always pretty. Press. Looking beautiful, yes? And in the same way, sew the other sleeve binding. Our next step is to set in the sleeve into the armhole. On the back side of the sleeve and on the back armhole, you'll see 2 notches. So matching those together, pin the sleeve into the armhole, right sides together. Match the center marks with the shoulder seams and pin all around. Then ease the top of the sleeve to give the right shape, molding it into the armhole. And sew, going slow and steady. Then serge, hiding the excess thread into the seam. Press the seam as it is to flatten the seam allowances, and take away your gathering stitch, and then press the seam allowances towards the sleeve from the right side. To hem our skirt, first serge the bottom edge and press. Then measuring to make sure that our skirt is the same length, fold the right side of the facing towards the right side of the dress, and pin the facing at the hem like this. Then sew, just like this. And when you fold it back to the right side, you'll have a beautifully sharp corner. You want to trim and then turn out the corners to the right side. And we're going to fold the serged bottom edge of the skirt to the wrong side and stitch in the middle of it, like so. press the hem all around. And for our very last part of the dress, mark the placement for your buttonholes, deciding this based on the size and amount of your buttons. I went with 11 since I'm using pretty small ones, and I made my buttons myself with the same fabric. On a scrap piece of fabric first, sew and test a few samples of the buttonholes to adjust the settings and choose the one that you like best, and then continue with that. Then make the holes with a seam ripper or small scissors. And placing the front edges of the dress together, at the center of the buttonholes, place a pin, and open up the top half. We'll have the pins on the other side that mark exactly where we need to sew the buttons. So, sew the buttons to the marked points. And of course, giving your entire garment a finishing press like always, we are done with our gorgeous melody dress. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this inspires you to sew this lovely piece yourself. I know you'll love it. You can get the PDF downloadable sewing pattern that I used below at the link in the description of this video, and happy sewing!